Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see some of you again. Ying is here. Good morning, Ying. Good morning again, Karen. Good morning again, Jenna. Hello, Lily. Hello, KC. Morning, Carmen. And good morning, Ella. Hope everyone's doing well this morning. I hope everyone's ready for the weekend. I think I am. Min's here. Good morning, Min. Luan's here. Good morning to you. Who else? Pearly's here. Good morning, Pearly. Who else? Who else is here? Adalbert's here. Good morning, Adalbert. Good morning again, Manish. Okay, so that's a good that's a good start. Yeah, let's dive in. You can keep saying hello in the live chat there, and I will say hello back, or you can say anything you like. So today we're going to finish off Mesopotamia. And we've been talking about Mesopotamia for a few days now. And where we left off yesterday, if you will remember, is we were talking about how important story is to human beings, right? We watched a little TED Talk given by Jonathan Gottschall, who wrote this book, The Storytelling Animal. And what he was trying to convince us of was that story is a very important part of what it is to be human. Not only are stories something that we like to tell and like to listen to and engage with and enjoy, Jonathan is saying that story is actually an important part of how human beings structure their lives. He's saying that we actually understand our lives by making it into a story. Okay, we tell ourselves a story about what our life means. Okay, and so story is a way in which we understand our lives. It's a framework, a tool for understanding things around us. And so stories are more than just, a fun thing that we enjoy. It's a critical part of who we are and how we understand the world around us. Who else is here? Lim is here. Good morning, Lim. And Aliana's here. Good morning. Sorry you're late. That's okay. Don't worry about it. So we talked a little bit about how important stories were, and we watched another video, a crash course video, in which the host kind of took us through the story of Gilgamesh. And it was a wild and crazy tale full of monsters and gods and sort of strange happenings, journeys to the underworld. All kinds of strange things happened in this story. We said, though, it's an important story because it's one of the first stories that we have access to. We presume that humans were telling stories probably for thousands of years before Gilgamesh, but of course those stories don't preserve unless someone writes them down. And so Gilgamesh is one of the earliest stories that we have record of. There's some evidence of it all the way back 4,000 years ago, and then there's other versions of that story that show up later. And so the Sumerians seem to have created this story about Gilgamesh, but later cultures who are in control of Mesopotamia, like the Akkadians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they continue to tell the story of Gilgamesh for some time later. We said that the story of Gilgamesh is what we would call a myth, and we said that myths are stories that are passed down from generation to generation. We said that myths usually contain some element of the fantastic, and so there's supernatural forces, or people have superpowers, or there's things that don't happen in regular life in a myth. And finally, we said that myths often contain lessons or morals. There's things that cultures want people to learn from these stories. That's part of the reason that they're told, not just for fun or entertainment, but to enculturate people, right? To teach them certain values and beliefs that the culture holds. And so with the Gilgamesh story, we listen to it and we kind of did a little analysis, and we tried to figure out what the story of Gilgamesh might tell us about the Sumerians. Whoops. We'll come back to that in a second. So Thika, good morning. So we said that a few of the things we might have been able to learn about this story was that maybe the Sumerians valued persistence, right? Because Gilgamesh was a persistent hero. He worked very hard trying to find eternal life and immortality, and of course he failed in the end, but he persisted in his quest, right? There was some bravery or courage that was shown by Gilgamesh, but also the value of redemption. And so in the beginning of the Gilgamesh story, he starts out as an unsympathetic hero. He is not the kind of guy that people like very much. And actually, if you think about the first Iron Man movie, Tony Stark starts out that way too, right? He's kind of he's cool, but he's a bit of a selfish jerk, right? And so Tony Stark is kind of redeemed in his story arc, and so Gilgamesh is kind of redeemed in his as well. Good morning, Mashid. That's okay. In terms of beliefs, and Michael's here. Good morning, Michael. We said that in terms of beliefs, we saw evidence of polytheism, right? There's multiple gods that show up or that are mentioned in the Gilgamesh story. And we see that gods deserve or require respect. And if you don't respect the gods, you will be punished. And so Gilgamesh is, or Enkidu actually is punished with his death after he sort of disgraces Ishtar, the goddess of love. And then we said, hey Sabrina, we also said that what can we learn from the epic of Gilgamesh? What does it mean to be a hero? And some of the things we said is that heroes don't always succeed, right? Heroes are people who fail. Good morning, Chris. Heroes are people who fail. And Gilgamesh fails numerous times in his adventures, right? He searches for immortality, he searches for eternal life and finds it only to foolishly lose it, right? He refuses marriage to a goddess and in the process manages to get his best friend killed, right? He fails in a number of important ways, but he's still a hero regardless. We say that in the end he succeeds because of his humanity, not his divinity. And so it's not the superhuman feats that Gilgamesh achieves, it's actually the knowledge that he gains in terms of being a mortal person and a better mortal person. And then we talked about the idea of the hero's journey. And so that was an idea that historian and academic Joseph Campbell comes up with. And the idea was that a lot of these hero stories, a lot of these hero quests follow a similar pattern. Many similar things happen to them. And so the graphic you see here is kind of a very simplified version of what Campbell suggested. And there are lots of stories historically and in terms of modern stories that fit this pattern. And what I suggested to you, and I don't know if you believe this or not, but what I suggested to you is that the hero's journey here is really a larger metaphor for our own lives, and the idea that we're all kind of on this hero's journey from birth to death. And so we're born and we kind of leave our homes eventually, even though we might not want to. We go out into the world and we encounter, we find friends, we encounter obstacles, we're challenged, but hopefully in the end we receive some sort of reward, and eventually we kind of return home with whatever this reward is, in kind of a metaphorical sense. Okay, so I think I think we could all agree that stories are certainly very entertaining and a very important part of our lives, but I think they're also a very powerful part of our lives too, in terms of helping us to make sense of our lives and our own experiences, and in helping to enculturate each other, in helping to teach the morals and values and beliefs of our particular culture. I think stories are a very powerful way to do that. Okay, so the next thing I asked you to do, and I'm sorry that there was so much reading. I'll try not to give you quite so much reading in one shot in the future. Um, but I asked you to read this section of the text, and I asked you to um, answer a few questions. And so the first question I asked you here is, what is an empire? What's an empire? Because this is kind of the first evidence we have of this type of political organization, right? And the first one is, as you saw in the textbook, we're attributing it to Sargon of Akkad, right? Ying says here that it's a large territory encompassing numerous states and ruled by a single authority. And Lim says the same thing. Yeah, that's very true. So empires are ruled by a single ruler or a single group. And again, they contain people of different ethnicities or cultures or nationalities, all ruled by a single group with a centralized government, right? So it could be a king, it could be an emperor, it could be some other form of government, but we have a centralized government that is in control of a large physical territory, and there are a number of different groups or different states within it. And Thika says, an empire is when a king consolidates national power in many areas and cities to expand the territory. Yeah, so those are all really good and really correct, right? That's what an empire is. Empires will become, these are kind of the first evidence we have of empires, but of course they'll become more popular, or they'll become an important part of world history as kind of ancient history progresses. Okay, so Michael Adalbert says here, an extensive group of state under a single supreme authority. Yep, that's very good too. Michael says it's where a king controls a lot of people. Yes, but there's a little more, and the little more is that they try to expand on other countries. That's true. And Carmen says a group of countries under a single authority. Yeah, so that's the important part to remember. We have a centralized government and a single point of control, but that a bunch of different states and a bunch of different peoples are under the control of that centralized government, okay? So we said that the Akkadians create the first empire in this part of the world, and one of the first empires in the world. And they, we'll get to that in a second. So one of these Akkadians, I think he's Akkadian, is Hammurabi. He's a king in Mesopotamia, and he creates this Hammurabi's code. And what's so interesting or important or significant about Hammurabi's code? Why are we talking about it today? Why are we talking about it today? So Thika says it's a set of standards for commerce, and imposes penalties for meeting the requirements of justice. Yes. Casey says it records a set of laws, and it's used to unify people and establish common standards. Yeah, good. It is a law code that is etched into a stele. A stele is a kind of a tall piece of stone, usually with carving on it. That is true. And Lim says and the code lists offenses and their punishments. Yeah, which varies by social class. That's interesting. And it tries to unify people. Yeah, so there's a few things going on here. Number one, we see that the Akkadians create an empire and they have a bunch of people under their control. And so prior to that, if you were just the king of your own city-state and you just controlled your city-state, then it would be very easy to maintain justice because you could make all the decisions. You were the king makes the laws, easy, right? But as the empire gets bigger and bigger, you can't be everywhere at once, right? A king cannot be in multiple cities handing out justice all the time, right? It's just not possible. And so Hammurabi's code allows, if you think about it, it allows him to be in multiple places at once, right? And so if someone commits an offense, we know how the king would punish him because it says so on the stone, right? And so again, it's a way that the king can be in multiple places at once and can dispense the same justice, can dispense the same punishments by having it written down. Pearlie says, unify people within the empire and establish common standards. Yeah, so everybody in the empire is being treated in a similar way. The king dispenses justice, and also on that stele we can see that he gets that power from the god, right? So the god of law and justice gives Hammurabi the power to dispense justice in the empire, right? And another important part of that is, again, we see that there are different punishments depending on who you are. And so if you're a free man, so if you're a merchant or something like that, if you're a free man and you hit another free man, then you're fined a piece of gold, right? That's your punishment. If you're a slave and you hit a free man, they'll cut off your ear, right? So people who are higher up in society, usually they're punished with fines, right? They have to pay money. People who are lower in society, they are usually subjected to, painful things or death, right? So we see that death is often a punishment, physical injury or physical disablement by cutting off people's ears or eyes or hands, that's a punishment. And so there's kind of different standards depending on who you are in society, right? Higher people pay fines. People who are lower on the social structure, they are going to be physically punished or killed if they break the law, right? And so this is one of the first law codes that we have in history, something that is written down that says what the rules are and what the punishments are. And again, you can imagine it as something that is necessary for Hammurabi to do because, again, he can't be everywhere handing out justice. And so if he carves it onto this stone and distributes stones around, then people can be judged according to the king's standards, even though he's not there. Okay, so the next question I asked you was this one. How did Mesopotamian rulers, or we could say Mesopotamian rulers, how did they bring people under control within their territory? How did they do that? Did they ask nicely? How did these rulers of empires get people under their control? Thika says they use their army to expand their territory, and so we're looking at military conquest here, right? And then they created laws to govern society. That's good, and imposed penalties, right? So there's a set of rules that come from the king, but these areas are brought under control by the military, right? By warfare. Scaring them with their rules and their weapons, yes, both of those things would have been scary. I don't know what you thought, but some of those laws frightened me a little bit. But yeah, they use their army for sure, Karen. Casey says, death is mostly a punishment given to people who disobey the law. Yes, and definitely people who are lower in the social hierarchy would be much more likely to be killed than someone higher up. Michael says, yeah, they control people with soldiers, and there's laws, and there's different levels of power. Yes, that's true as well. So they, excuse me. So let me just go back to, this here for a second. So just very quickly, so this is what we'll say an empire is. And of course, all of you were correct in your answers. It's a state or an area that is controlled by a single centralized government, whether it's an emperor or a king or some kind of government. There are a collection of nations or people that are under the control of one group. And so for Mesopotamian empires, and for many later empires as well, the way that they kind of maintain control is through military force, right? They march their armies in with their swords and shields. They take over. I think you read in the textbook one soldier's description of what he did, and he cut a bunch of people into pieces, and he hung their heads from trees, and really kind of awful stuff. But people were brought under control through military means, right? And by fear. The other thing that they mention really quickly in the text, and that I'll mention here, is that empires receive tribute from conquered states. And so if your city-state is under the control of an empire, you owe them money, basically. Every year you have to send a certain amount to them, whether it's in grain or animals or other types of valuables. You owe them tribute. You owe them cash, basically. Although we should say that if you were taken over as part of an empire, sometimes, depending on the empire, sometimes it wasn't all bad. So yes, if you were conquered, a lot of people would die, and you might be under the control of a city-state that you might not want to be under the control of. But empires are good for things too, because they do a few things. They're very good at creating trade networks. And so if you were a part of an empire, you might have access to other trade markets within the empire that you might not have normally. And so sometimes empires are good for business. The other thing we see, and maybe not so much in this period, but later, particularly with the Romans, the Roman Empire builds roads all throughout Europe. And so if you're a part of the Roman Empire, you get to use their roads. And so you can very easily travel through the empire and trade. You can go about your business activities. And so that's a benefit of being part of an empire too, is that sometimes they build roads and bridges and things that you can use. And finally, if you're part of an empire, you will be protected by that empire, right? If the Akkadians take over your city-state, they don't want anyone taking that city-state away from them. And so they will protect you from invasion from other groups. Yes, you're under the control of the Akkadians, but you don't have to worry about being attacked by anyone else now. So being in an empire, depending on who you are and when you are and who your ruler is, can be a bad thing, but it can also have some beneficial effects as well. So the Code of Hammurabi here, we have the first clear written law code in history as far as we know. And again, we see that depending on your social, your position in the social hierarchy, you are treated differently under the law. And again, that's different from most modern states where everyone is supposed to be equal before the law, right? Yeah, so here's a picture. I think you saw that in the textbook of the stele, the piece of stone on which Hammurabi's code is written. And this is kind of what it looks like. And you can see that the cuneiform writing that the Sumerians developed, the Akkadians kind of borrowed and wrote their own language in it. And so you can almost see it looks very similar to the Sumerian script, and because it is, but it's used to write the language of the Akkadians, not the language of the Sumerians. Also, I don't know if it mentioned in the text as well, but Akkadian, so what you see here is it's written in the Sumerian script, but it's actually a Semitic language, Akkadian. And so Akkadian is connected to or related to Arabic. It's related to Hebrew. It's related to Farsi, I think. And so those languages are kind of connected to each other. But here we see here we see Akkadian written in Sumerian script. And the last question, let's just go back for a second here. The last question I asked you was this one here. What are some of the legacies of Mesopotamia? And so what are some of the things that what are some of the lasting impacts of Mesopotamian civilizations? The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Neo-Babylonians, the Assyrians. What are some things that we have inherited from them, or what's the significance of their civilizations? Because there are many. There are many. What are some of the legacies? What are some of the things that have come down to us? Let's see. Okay, so Thika's got here. Okay, so we have one of the 7 wonders of the world. And so Nebuchadnezzar, I believe, is credited in history as creating this massive hanging garden within Babylon. And even though we don't have any archaeological evidence of where it was exactly or what it looked like, we have some ancient descriptions of this very beautiful sort of garden within the city that sort of defied belief. And so, yeah, that's part of it. We have one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world coming from that part. Innovative ways to handle nature, like farming methods. Yes. So all of this kind of development was kicked off by agriculture, right? By the ability to stay in one place, to live in one place, to farm your fields over and over again, and to manage irrigation, right? Building canals and ditches and other storage facilities for grain. All of that technology allowed people to grow lots of food, and their ability to do that led them to be able to do all of the other things that happened. Come on, give me more. There's way more. Other legacies. What's the kind of lasting impact or great achievements of these Mesopotamian civilizations? I'll give you a hint. That's a hint. Adalbert says, various legal codes. So we see the world's first, or one of the world's first written law codes, right? So justice isn't being dispensed by kings or by priests. It's actually written down. And again, that's something that we do today, right? All countries have their own written law codes that people adhere to, right? So that's an important development, right? Written written laws. What else? There's more. There's tons of stuff. We have the world's first empires, basically, or some of the first empires. Again, empires will become important really all the way up until the 1800s, right, with the British Empire. And so the empires as a political organization will play a huge role in history all the way up until the very, very recent past. And that starts here 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. We have the world's first law codes, like Adalbert mentioned. We have innovations in farming that allowed people to stay in one place and grow lots of food and develop complicated civilizations. We have one of the world's first written scripts. People actually start to write things down in this area of the world, and that gives us access to their thoughts and their feelings and their beliefs in a way that we didn't have access to them before. We have monumental architecture. We have these people building gigantic stone cities and stone temples. We have some of the world's first stories, or at least stories that we have access to in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The textbook also mentions contributions of science and math. And so some of the pictures we saw in terms of the ziggurats, the temples that they built, and the walls that encircled their cities, you can't build those things unless you have a very good understanding of science and engineering and mathematics. You can't just build a wall without understanding those things. And so the Sumerians actually developed a system of math and geometry and engineering and astronomy that we can still access today and that we still use. So here you can see that Sumerian calendars had 12 lunar months, basically like ours does. And they actually knew that their calendar was a little bit out of sync. And so again, they adjusted it with a 13th month every 3 years. The Sumerians had, and I think they mentioned this in the textbook here, they had a numerical system that used 60 as its base. And that's kind of come down to us, right? Because we're still using 60-minute hours. We're still using 24-hour days. We're still using a 360-degree circle. Some of these geometric formulas here in terms of circumference and radius and diameter of a circle, they had these formulas. They knew how, they figured out this math and geometry. And they even roughly figured out, actually they roughly figured out this geometry so that they were able to use it. So these people were innovators. And when you think of what came before, for really hundreds of thousands of years, people were living in very simple groups, right? Very simple hunter-gatherer groups, very simple technology, moving around a lot and kind of living off the land. But in a period from about 12,000 years ago to about 7,000 years ago, people begin to innovate, right? So society changes, subsistence strategies change, political organization changes, social organization changes. All these things radically change as a result of switching to this new way of living in terms of growing your own food. And so we see cities, we see empires, We see long distance trade networks. We see social stratification. We see different levels of power within a civilization. We see the world's first writing, and we see mathematics and science and engineering. And of course, some of those things we still use today. And so it's a very significant time in history when, again, a lot of the pieces that make up our modern world in terms of living in cities, having law codes, having governments, engaging in trade with places that are far away, living off agriculture, all of those things are things that we still do. And they, one of the places that they start is in this part of the world. And so we kind of owe a large debt to the Sumerians and the Akkadians and people who came after them for developing things that we still continue to use today. Okay, so let's move on to Egypt. So just like human evolution, Egypt is a culture that I really find interesting, and so I have to be careful not to spend too much time on it. But the good news here is that Egypt as a culture is, or the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians culture, is actually a part of this course, and so we can spend a little more time on it, which I enjoy. But yeah, I've always been really fascinated by the country and the culture and sort of what happened there for thousands of years. Maybe I'll ask you a quick question. What did you think of the little video that you watched before class started? What was your impression of that video? What'd you think of it? It was entertaining. Okay, good. I know the computer animation was okay. I know we've all seen better computer animation than that, but that's okay. One of the things that's really interesting about a course like this, especially when you're dealing with ancient history, is kind of the ability to sort of project yourself into the past. And I think videos like that help you to do that. They kind of help you imagine what it would have been like to live in Egypt, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Is it from a video game? Do they use it in High Civilization? Yeah. The views of nature. Yeah, it was quite beautiful. It was quite a beautiful picture of what it looked like. Although it seemed like the sun was always kind of going down, interestingly enough. But yeah, I think it was kind of cool. It gives you a little window into what that world, I think, would have looked like. Again, I don't know if it's perfectly historically accurate. Oh, it's from Assassin's Creed? Okay. That's cool. Even though it's from a video game, I think that from what I can tell, it seems reasonably historically accurate. Maybe not perfect. You play, okay. So you're the expert here. Okay. Yeah, I think it's reasonably historically accurate, or at least good enough for us to get an impression of what it would have been like to live in a civilization like this. So again, as we walk through Egyptian culture, we want to pay attention to the culture and how it's connected to the environment the Egyptians live in. We want to look at their politics, and so who has power in their society and how they use authority and how they govern themselves, how they interact and exchange with other cultures. Oh yeah, I still got to fix that. Culture and environment is in there twice. Whoops. How conflicts are managed, both within the culture and outside of the culture. Their values and beliefs. And of course, this is probably going to be a big part of what we talk about here in ancient Egypt. and of course their cultural expressions, and so how they express themselves in terms of their art or their literature, or other things. All right, so Egypt, of course, is one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. It's at the same time as the Sumerians are kind of developing their civilization in Mesopotamia. The Egyptians are getting their civilization going in Egypt. Okay, and Egypt, of course, has a very complex society with that evolves over time, and it's a very long-lived civilization as well. Um, the Egyptian civilization lasts for thousands of years, and so. But what's remarkable is that even through that time, even over thousands of years, many parts of their culture remain consistent. And so, if you think about the culture that you and I are living in, whether we're here in Canada or whether you're in your home country, um, the pace of cultural and technology change today is very, very rapid. And so, I live in a very different, you and I live in a very different world than my parents grew up in, and they lived in a different world than their parents grew up in. But Egypt has a lot of consistency, and so really for hundreds of years, people would have lived in a very similar cultural climate, and many things wouldn't have changed radically throughout the, from generation to generation, which is interesting to think about. Egypt started out as two kingdoms, two kind of groups that were unified around 3100 BC. So around 5,000 years ago, Egypt becomes a single powerful state. One of the most important parts of Egypt, of course, is the Nile River. And so one of the first historians that we have record of, a Greek named Herodotus kind of famously writes that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And what he means, of course, is that the only reason that Egypt exists as a country is because of the river. The rest of Egypt, of course, is a barren desert. You can't really live there. You definitely can't grow any crops there. And so the entire reason for Egypt's existence is the Nile, is this river. The Egyptians themselves, they would often refer to their land as Kemet, which means black land. And so that's named after the sort of rich, dark soil that lines the Nile River close to their settlements. And so, as I mentioned, this is a civilization that thrived for thousands and thousands of years. And as we're probably familiar with, constructed all kinds of monumental architecture. They had a very sort of rich and complex religion and artistic tradition. They had very complex political mechanisms as well, not to mention their knowledge of science and technology. And so they're a very kind of impressive civilization. They're a civilization that we know quite a bit about. And they've been intriguing to people really for thousands of years. And so just as people today look back at ancient Egypt and kind of marvel at what these people were able to do, people in the past did it as well. And so today, Egypt is a tourist destination for people wanting to look at the remains of ancient Egyptian culture. But actually, that was the case even in antiquity. And so Greeks and Romans were tourists as well, and they went to Egypt thousands of years ago and did the same thing. Okay, I'm going to jump to here. So yeah, Egypt is a very beautiful country, at least in my opinion. There are lots of classic images from Egypt that we might be familiar with. The pyramids here at Giza are probably the most famous, but there's many, many monuments within the country that we may have seen. This is a satellite photograph of Egypt, and again, you can see very clearly how important the river is to Egypt, because really there's nothing outside of that river valley that is a place where people can live. And so all of ancient Egypt's, all the places that people lived, all the places that people grew food were really right next to the Nile River, and then in the Nile Delta that you can see at the top of the picture there. And everything else is basically uninhabitable desert. But this was actually a very useful environment for the Egyptians to develop in, because in a way they were kind of isolated from their neighbors. They were protected from their neighbors. And so if you look here again, this is a really difficult country to invade thousands of years ago, because almost wherever you come from, you have to march across huge sections of desert just in order to get to Egypt itself. And that was a very difficult thing to do thousands of years ago. It wasn't so easy to carry food, it wasn't so easy to carry water, and it certainly wasn't easy to traverse rocky, sandy deserts. And so for a long time, Egypt was kind of safe to develop on its own. It was able to build all of its monuments, develop its agriculture, and really without any interference from the outside, because again, the desert served as a protection for it. It was very difficult to traverse this desert in order to get to Egypt. And so as a result, Egypt was, historically anyway, was a much more peaceful place than Mesopotamia, right? Mesopotamia had a bunch of city-states. Those city-states were constantly kind of fighting with each other. Eventually, the Akkadians would take them all over and create an empire. And so there was a lot of military conflict that happened within Mesopotamia that, for the most part, didn't happen within Egypt, because, again, it was a very difficult place to get your army to. And so the Egyptians were able to rule themselves for quite some time. One of the most important parts of Egypt, and we'll talk about this more on Monday, was the fact that the Nile would flood predictably every year. And so what would happen is, kind of in Central Africa, there would be a rainy season. There'd be lots of rain that would come down from the mountains, and it would funnel its way into the Nile River. And so every year, at a reasonably predictable time, the Nile would flood, and when the water came back down, there would be a nice thick layer of organically rich mud. And so basically nature was fertilizing the Egyptians' fields every year. Every year the Egyptians got new fertile soil to grow from. And so when you combine that with the really sunny, warm climate that Egypt has, and when you combine it with the fact that they too were creating canals and irrigation ditches and ways of watering their crops, Egypt became very agriculturally productive. And so, as I mentioned there in the slide, they were actually able to raise 2 crops a year. And so the Egyptians really had a ton of food available to them. And that's part of the reason why they were able to develop this very complicated civilization, why they were able to build the monuments and do the things that they were able to do, is because they had so much food. And again, if one farm can produce enough for 5 or 6 or 7 families, that means all of those people don't have to farm, right? They can do other things. And so kind of the wealth of Egypt and the complicated things that culture is able to do is directly connected to their ability to produce food. And as it turns out, they were very good at producing food, and a lot of it, and therefore they were able to do other things. Okay. All right. So the last thing I would like you to do for me is just a little bit of homework, but I think you have enough time to do it before the end of class. I want to take you back to that idea about the power of story. And so we said that stories are critically important to cultures. They help to pass on beliefs and values. They're entertaining, but they also serve as a way for human beings to understand their lives. Okay, and so Jonathan Gottschall said that we're constantly in the process of trying to create story. We're trying to tell ourselves the story of our lives, the story of our family, the story of our country, the story of our planet. This course, this entire course, in a way, is a story about what it means to be human and how human cultures operate. So, story is a way, it's a framework that people apply to the world and use it to create some sort of order and some sort of understanding for them. And so, again, Jonathan Gottschall was saying that stories are critically important and that we should pay attention to them. And so, what I would like you to do for homework is just a very short thing for me. I'd like you to write just a little thing for me, maybe 5 or 6 sentences. It doesn't have to be super, super long. But it has to do with heroes. And I'd like to know which hero, and not real life hero here. You might want to say, your parents or something, but don't say that. Which kind of fictional hero, which kind of hero from a story has inspired you or kind of resonates with you? And so what hero's journey or hero's story inspires you and why? Okay, how does the story and the journey of the hero that inspires you, how does it help you to think about your own life? How does it help you to better understand the life that you live? Okay, and so this can be a movie hero, this can be a television show hero, this can be a literary hero, so a hero from a book. I guess it could be a hero from a video game too, although I'm not sure that would work quite as well, but maybe. That's what I would like you to do, is to write me just like a very short paragraph, a few sentences, talking about who's a story hero that has inspired you, and how does it help you to understand your own life. Okay, so I'll ask you to do that for me. When you're done, you can send me an email with it, and just a little, typed up thing would be great. Think about it, write it, send it to me. If you need a little more time to think, that's okay. You don't have to have it done by the end of class, but you can use the rest of class time to do it. I'm going to post it in Microsoft Teams here so that you can see it. Yeah, so I posted it in Microsoft Teams so that you can see it. Can it be historical figure? Yeah, it can be a historical figure, I guess, too. Because I guess, we tell stories about historical figures, right? They become a character in a story, even though the story might be true, and the character might have been a real person. So yeah, if you have a historical figure that serves as heroic inspiration for you, then yeah, that works for me. Okay, so is everyone good? Can we do that? Do you want to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or if you have a question, you can ask me. Let me know. Is that good? Does it make sense? Okay, so it's looking Looking good. Lots of thumbs up and I got this and things like that. Okay. So you need if you if you can finish it today, Ying, then that's good. You know, if you need a little more time, it's fine. I don't have a hard. There's not a hard deadline for this, but I'll give you the rest of the time today. Where do we send it to me? You can email it to me, and I'll put that in I'll put that in Microsoft Teams as well. Okay. Okay. Everybody seems good. Everybody seems good. Okay, so do that for me. Email it to me when you're done. Again, there's no hard deadline, but you know, if you can send it to me today, that's probably good. Other than that, I'll leave it there. If you have any questions, of course, you can always message me. And on Monday, we'll pick it up and we'll start digging into Egypt, which I will enjoy. And I hope you will too. Okay, so thank you for being here today. Thank you for participating. Sorry about all the reading. And I hope everyone has a good weekend. And I will see you Monday, okay? So, bye.